You're connecting with someone deeply tied to the intelligence world. Before you were even a teenager, you had direct contact with George Bush Sr., Sergeant Shriver, who worked directly under JFK during his presidency. You served as a surrogate speaker for Arnold Schwarzenegger. You interacted with Bill and Hillary Clinton. Connected with Marianne Wilson during her presidential run in 2016. Martin O'Malley, the two-time governor of Maryland, who also ran for presidency. You met with Barack Obama. You had contact with Bernie Sanders, and you had ongoing communication with Bobby Kennedy. You even had dinner with Elon Musk. Sebastian, are you a part of the CIA?
I'm not, no.
What's the actual job of the president? Who does the president really work for?
A dictator really runs the government. In America, the government is run ultimately now by companies.
You've been on over 100 magazine covers without taking any drugs.
I've never taken anything. Stem cells is an interesting one. There are a few types of stem cells, but some are coming from an umbilical cord, which to me draws a real serious moral question. One that comes from, gets stuck in the fallopian tube and has to be aborted and never becomes an embryo. There are potentials, moreover, with that, but I think the question about where it comes from becomes really important.
You've seen UAP photos. Do you believe in aliens?
Is there transhuman intelligence? Yeah, look around. When you think about transhuman intelligence, that's transhuman. In other words, we are a derivative of transhuman intelligence. We are, on one level, the aliens.
Tell me about your thoughts on the pyramids.
The idea is, was that these are tombs, and yet how many bodies have been discovered there, right? None. How many bodies around Egypt? Like over 1 million cats and other places that are buried with such care, and yet none in these grand pyramids. It's amazing what's occurring there 4,000 years ago.
Do you have a proof for God, Sebastian? In your TED talk, you mentioned an exercise that demonstrates this.
This I amness, that's proof of God.
Epstein Island. What really happened there, in your view? Sebastian, before we get into today's conversation, I want to introduce you in a way that actually does justice to the scale of what you've done, because most people don't realize how unusual your trajectory has been, Sebastian. First, in the world of health and fitness, you've been featured on over 100 magazine covers, more than any natural athlete in history. Not only were you on these covers, but you produced many of them yourself. That alone is a lifetime achievement for most people. Second, you created the series, The 8 Question. 51 episodes that you wrote, produced, directed with some of the most extraordinary people alive. World-class fighters, artists, business leaders, innovators, cultural figures, people who have shaped, history, media, sports, philosophy, and art. Third, your film career includes sort of your first feature, Grace and Grit, which premiered in the legendary Chinese theater IMAX, the same stage as Rocky, Top Gun, Gone with the Wind, where they opened. This is a milestone that most filmmakers never reach. Fourth, in psychology and philosophy, you just delivered a TED talk on invisible energies and forces that drive our lives. And your work in this field has been acclaimed by some of the biggest names such as Ken Wilber, James Hollis, Deepak Chopra, Alex Gray, John Mackey, and many more. So when you take a step back and take a look at the whole picture, by your early 40s, you hit this pinnacle across many completely different arenas: health and fitness, film and storytelling, psychology and philosophy, and cultural influence. Which leads me, and probably everyone listening, to the real question, Sebastian, are you a part of the CIA?
Thank you for that. I'm not, no. It's a great question though.
Because let me tell you why I asked you that. Because when you start painting the picture, it sort of gets a bit wild. Not just in a guy had an interesting life type of way, but in a way where the same themes keep showing up. Information, power, influence, and these uncanny intersections between you and some of the most important people on the planet. So let me walk through this, because when you lay it out chronologically, a pattern starts to emerge. You were born in Oxford, England. The doctor who delivered you didn't just go on to have a medical career, but he eventually ran the climate initiative at the United Nations. And you two reconnected decades later at Norman Lear's house. And then suddenly your life starts intersecting with some of the most powerful people on earth. Before you were even a teenager, you had direct contact with George Bush Sr. And what most people forgot is that before he became president, he was the director of the CIA. And you weren't just connecting with a president, you were connecting with someone deeply tied to the intelligence world. From there, the intersections keep unfolding. You spent time at the Kennedy compound, at Hyannisport, the same place tied to the infamous image of JFK and Bobby Kennedy. You met Sergeant Shriver, who worked directly under JFK during his presidency. You served as a surrogate speaker for Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor. You had direct communication with McCann Delrahim, the former Assistant US Attorney General. You interacted with Bill and Hillary Clinton. You connected with Marianne Wilson during her presidential run in 2016. You met Martin O'Malley, the two-time governor of Maryland, who also ran for presidency in 2016. You met with Barack Obama. You had contact with Bernie Sanders during his presidency campaign. And you had ongoing communication with Bobby Kennedy. You even had dinner with Elon Musk. So, when you line this all up, from the UN to the CIA to the White House to Silicon Valley to presidential candidates, it stops looking random. And that's sort of why I asked you the question earlier, not because, I think you're actually in espionage, but because your life seems to follow this unmistakable pattern. How information travels, how power clusters, how invisible forces move. And how certain people like you keep showing up at the crossroads of global culture, leadership, psychology, and transformation. So it feels less like a coincidence and more like a gravitational field where information, power, influence seems to just bend towards you, Sebastian, which is quite interesting. So I guess, Sebastian, after everything I just laid out, I have to ask you honestly, are you in the CIA? Because this is just crazy, everything I laid out.
I really appreciate the diligent research, and it's one of the reasons why you have such great guests on your podcast, and it's an honor to be here. I think about the way information travels, right, and showing up, at the crossroads of these things. And I'm not. And it was interesting. I like to watch great public speakers and journalists and orators. As a boy, watching MLK, of course, brilliant. And Joseph Campbell, who I met when I was a boy at a beach, at a moonrise in Hawaii when I was a boy. And I think there is something about storytelling, as I talk about in the TED Talk, in the TEDx talk, about these invisible forces. But it's not so much even that they are traveling through us, but that we're derivative of them. So, there's a Zen adage, right, that there's many, many paths, one journey. In other words, you go up Mount Everest and all these different paths to get there potentially, but the journey is all the same. It's about becoming. It's about risk, eventually confronting mortality, willing to risk our life. And perhaps not in the conventional sense of reincarnation, but just in this convention of saying, or transconventional sense of saying, well, I'm derivative of God, right? And this is an extrapolation of storytelling, right? Of myth, whether we look at, let's say, the Great Flood, which happens in every culture, right? Around the same time. And so perhaps there's a lot of factual background on that, as Graham Hancock covers in his series, I think on Netflix, talking about the Younger Dryas period and the Earth being different. In other words, where I'm going with that in terms of relationship to intelligence and to global agencies, as you brought up, that we're derivative of those stars. And everyone's getting into that now, but they're getting into it in a very pop conventional way, saying, okay, you are the stardust, right? Well, fine. What does that mean? What that means is that there is this invisible thing that's occurring. We're alive for maybe 100 years, boom, dead, so what, right? Well, what's really going on is we are the extrapolation of all these things. And so perhaps, right, and that with the famous Marcus Aurelius statement that what you do in this life echoes into eternity. And that doesn't mean that what you do now echoes forward. It's echoing in all these different cosmic extrapolations of God. In other words, if you're looking at string theory, it's happening in some different path, but same journey in other lifetimes. In other words, if you decide to show up and show up and show up, you end up at the crux of all the action all the time, again and again and again. And we all feel it in our life when we say, you know what, I'm not doing this, which is what I want to do. I'm doing this because intuitively I know I need to do that. And then it's not reward, right? It's not reward because it's not on a good, bad, reward system, the cosmos. It's about becoming. That God wants to become through you, through me, through us, right? And so when we keep showing up, information just spreads, it travels. It was interesting because, I like watching great, as I was saying, speakers and journalists, and I'm going to put a button on this related back to the CIA, was that, Tucker Carlson, like him or not, right? When he got fired from Fox because of that deal that went down, that was his biggest explosion in his career. It took him from top to huge, right? And hugely independent as well. And he had, Putin on, right? And Barbara Walters interviewed a lot of controversial people, and she was more liberal, Tucker was more conservative. She interviewed, dictators and such, right? Because it's important to have the conversation. And he had Putin on, and Putin said the same thing, right? He said, look, you had a relationship and potentially, we're looking and vying for the CIA, and Tucker's, no, he did not, end up. And people have talked about that with Walter Cronkite as well. And Cronkite vehemently, denied that, though there are, thousands of people in media, the tops of media, and in journalism, particularly in government, on all governments who are related to CIA, Mossad, etc. And it's not that that's their only job, right? It's that they are, ultimately brokering information. And like in any career, in any vocation, in any art, in any devotion, there are good parents and lousy parents, good lovers and bad lovers, good cops and bad cops, good priests, bad priests. There are people who really want to succeed and also contribute, and that's an intuitive sense. And so I think then the ultimate question becomes around, does it matter, right? Because there are people who are brokering information at the highest level through, sort of, to use your term, espionage, in a way that isn't aggressive, but it's well, look, at some juncture, we have to share information with each other and globally. And at some juncture, we have to withhold certain types of information for the safety of what people can take and not take. But I appreciate the intro and the diligent research and background. I have been very fortunate and blessed to succeed in psychology and in movies, yeah, and in health and fitness, for sure. And those things have been at the center of my life since I was a little boy, and I always felt it. I didn't know it up here, but I felt it, and I just have devoted my time to all these things, the same that I do today.
I love that. You brought up the Tucker Carlson Putin interview. I remember that section where Putin talks about not needing to talk to the president directly because the president isn't the one that really makes all the decisions. What's the actual job of the president? Like, who does the president really work for, Sebastian?
That's such a great question, right? And I think that the idea, that we have in a democratic republic or democracy is that the people elect this person runs the state, right? But it's obviously not the case. We look at, this person has influence, no question. But there are structures that stay in place, for many decades, right? And those structures, there are people who have been around, a decade, shallow end of the pool, to 30 years, 40 years, right? And so if you're in, in an agency or a government position or a job, in any company, and you see people coming and going and coming and going, and people show up and they want to make a big splash, and you say, look, okay, I get it. Maybe they'll make some sort of, change a little bit subtly, but, you can't just pass off this information to all the newcomers and then, have to reinform all the new people, et cetera, again and again and again. In other words, yes, there are greater structures that are in place. And, you look at the United States of America, and, I had this chair in my living room that's from England from it's about 500 years old, right? And it's twice as old as America. And I think, wow, I sat in that chair before everybody even thought about what is the structure of America, and who was even inhabiting these plains, then. And so then you look at China and you're saying, wow, this place is so, ancient. And their playbook is not, 5, 10 years ahead, it's hundreds of years ahead, and they look at, the birth of America, how can we penetrate that? That's very important. That's a nice little sliver over there between the Pacific and the Atlantic. We need to make sure we have our presence there, as are other forces and countries. And so I think, like, yes, and then in other words, in short, what's the job of the president and or a dictator, right? That a dictator really runs the government, right? I mean, and Putin, Russia is not, the soil is not fertile for democracy, and people like him there for the most part. He's impressive, like him or not, he's brilliant, like him or not. And he runs the government, right? And so in America, the government is run ultimately now by companies. In other words, that there are people who have says, but Congress is beholden. Almost everyone in Congress is beholden to this, that, or the other. In the White House, people are beholden to, many different influences. And the driver of those influences, and who are mandating law, are owned, by capitalistic interests. And then so ultimately, companies run a democracy, and government runs, the government under a dictator runs the country, in an autocracy. It's interesting because you think about these different presidents, and you think about the way the world moves, and you see this sort of torch gets passed on, and how much does it change, conservative or liberal? Not that much. And the instability when people split to the extremes of ultra conservative and ultra liberal and start fighting each other doesn't make any difference. Zip, zero, none. It makes none. It's going to always move back and forth, right? 8, 12 years, 4 years. It's going to move back and forth. What does that benefit? The instability benefits the centralization of power, right? On a national level and international level. And when people start to see that, they say, look, I don't need to participate in this so aggressively. I can participate in the ideas and the conversations, be against pain and suffering and such like this. But boy, there's something else here, and these decisions aren't being made by these some of these individuals are just puppets. And so it's like looking at that structure, from a broader viewpoint, right?
Interesting. So if it's the companies that run the USA in the background, who do you then believe will be the next president then, Sebastian?
That's a great question. I think, no preference, right? But I think that, there are, possibly, if the companies feel like they have a grasp on this White House and they want to continue that in that way, then Vance will extend, for 8 years. If there's a transition and if they don't feel like they've got a good hold on that, then Bobby Kennedy for sure, seems to be the independent, person who, has sway, both conservative and liberal, and also could get the backing of the big players like Elon Musk and Joe Rogan and sort of the news outlets and Tucker and et cetera, all these voices that are important. Because the election's fixed on both sides, right? Everybody's fixing the election, everybody. Like if you can decide who's going to be president, you're going to decide it, right? And so you can fix it 10, 20, 15%, maybe more, maybe less, but you still have to be popular. You still have to have the cult of personality. Right. And so Jimmy Carter was a brilliant guy, and I read his book, and his book is about his conflict with being Christian and being president, and how that conflict, was very challenging because every signature he made hurt people and helped people. But those days, with the, Reagan starting, it really became the days of outstanding orators. I mean, obviously there have been great orators, prior to that, right? Many brilliant ones, James Garfield and JFK, Lincoln, et cetera. But after that, it really, now with media and the lateral move of information, the president has to be a great orator, right? Because he's got to convince the world of what's happening. He doesn't have to sell it to the world because it's happening anyways. But he needs to say, look, this is happening, and I want you to like this and trust me, whether you're Obama or Trump, right? That, they're getting the world to listen. Clinton as well, right? Amazing orator. Bush, different type of communicator, but impressive, both of them. on some level to be able to reach people. So I think and I think, for Trump, the extension of that, if you think like, wow, if so many presidents, the sons, or the siblings, or, the relatives. So Trump, he obviously, who's he going to run? If he wants his last name in there, yeah, maybe it's Vance and then one of his sons, right? Eric, or maybe the younger son in 8 years, 12 years, 10 years, whatever. But if that's too far off for him, then maybe that's, Ivanka or Jared, his, son-in-law, if he wants to hold the power, and I think that he's vulnerable in that way, right? And I think that the companies, they see that obviously. They say, look, this guy's really vulnerable. Like he's clear what he wants, and that's our entrance point, So I think that's to be considered when looking at, who will the next president be. That being said, though, it's also miracles happen and it's a dynamic, moving, radical force, Clinton was the person, and then all of a sudden Obama rocketed, and he was just such a brilliant public speaker and likable guy that, everybody was like, okay, this is the guy, we can sell anything with this guy. And not to say that the president's not mandating law, they are, yeah, but it's just I think it's naive to think that that's, the president is not a dictator. And I think that this idea, the structure, as it was written in the Constitution, it's pretty amazing, but it has greater influence now, which draws it in multiple directions. So I think those are the potentials, of the probables, I think, for the next cycle, the next election cycle. But it doesn't really matter which one of those people it is, because either way, the path is, it's going to happen. The things that are being laid down now are juggernauts. They're hard to stop.
Interesting. You sort of just mentioned the brokerage of information and how important information is. This sort of makes me to think of Epstein Island. What really happened there, in your view, Sebastian?
This is such a provocative interview. That's a great question. Obviously, so many people went there, and, here's a guy, Jeffrey Epstein, that was, brokering information, and people are aware of that. And there's a relationship there with putting people in compromising positions, like Puff Daddy as well, right? Also, ties to CIA, Mossad, probably other agencies, right? But irrelevant of that, the question becomes, Epstein Island is not about kids, right? That happens down there. I think what happens, to paint a picture of that, is somebody goes into a room, they get a massage, and then there's a video, and then you edit a reality show, you can make anybody the good guy and the bad guy, and then all of a sudden you have this video that's pretty compelling, and you're with this, girl who's, 16 or whatever the thing is, and, you've kissed her or whatever the thing is. And so then it's like, look, we have to pass this law, or you have to do me this favor, or this kind of thing. That the mission there is not about child trafficking, right? It's about brokerage of information. And the fastest way to broker information, right, is to pressure with the benefit, and pressure, with a consequence. And so I think that island became a point of contest for that was, executed in a certain way. And then you see, like, obviously, Trump campaigned on releasing it, and then why isn't it being released? Why is everything being redacted? Because then you open up all this information and you look at it, and there's information there that says, wow, we can't release this information. This is too much of a valuable technology related to, things that are super advanced that, other countries have to some degree or not. And we need to hold on to that. And then also the companies, who are ultimately pulling strings as well, saying, listen, we need to hold this information and this technology perhaps. And, that's just all there is to it. You can't put all these people on trial, period. Some of them are guilty, some of them are not, but appear guilty. And if you're going to put them some away, you're going to have to put all away, and you can't put XXX, these three people away, let's say, for instance. And so it just doesn't come out, and it won't. It's the same thing. It's interesting with like the Puff Daddy trial. It's the same situation. Kanye was, vocalizing that Puff Daddy was in the CIA many years ago, right? So he's still a brilliant rapper. He's still an amazing musician, right? Regardless of anything else, right? But is he brokering information? I mean, it seems so, right? He's having a bunch of parties, a bunch of people in precarious positions. You get an invite, I had had an invite before, and I was like, up and coming guy, and I was just like, you know what, I'm interested in this world. I'd met him once. I think it's the Four Seasons, and I'll stay away from that, thanks, just intuitively. But people get put in compromising positions, and then they're like, geez, this is, I gotta share this information or make this move with my company or fire this person and hire this person, and so I really appreciate also the stream of thought that this discussion is about, and the moving, right, of information.
Interesting. You briefly mentioned sort of the withholding of information, especially when it comes to technology. That makes me swiftly transition to you telling me that you've seen UAP photos from your last home. What do you believe these aliens are, these UAPs? Do you believe in aliens?
What a great question. It's not a question really of belief, right? I took those photos that are on my Instagram, right? Like third row down, I put them up. And I took them like 9 years ago or something like that, from my last home, which overlooked all of LA and Century City. And I was just looked out the window, and my place was ceiling to floor, wall to wall glass. And I took like 5 pictures or something with my iPhone, didn't edit, nothing pretty provocative. I don't know what that is, moving in a way that is just not, like laterally up, down, and then gone. And I posted them online. This is before social media was really popular. I put them on, I think, I forget, it was called MobiPic, I think, yeah, via Twitter. And then at that time, and then I put them on Instagram, yeah, years later. And then I went on Stuart Davis's podcast, Aliens and Artists, and he had only people on who had had these kinds of experiences or had this kind of images, and people who are respectable, established individuals, etc. Brilliant, brilliant guy. I should connect you guys also as well. He'd be a wonderful guest. And people, when I put that out there, people really responded in ways that, and you can look at the comments right below those images. What are you trying to say? Is what a lot of the response was. And I'm not saying anything. I'm saying I took these photos. That's all I'm saying. you know? And so it acted like as a Rorschach block. And where I'm going with that in terms of belief, right, with alien or UFO or transhuman intelligence and life force, is that people can absorb it to the degree that their creativity and their capacity for creative, tangential and intuitive thought can allow. In other words, for the capacity to be able to hold multiple perspectives, which is how Ken Wilber would describe intelligence. How many multiple perspectives of, can you hold at one time, right? My perspective, your perspective, the us perspective, the perspective of the group, of the country, of the world, of God, et cetera, right? And so, and then also intuitively, how creative, right? Can you allow in? Can you be, right? And Einstein, he would even indicate that all of his work is predicated on creativity and having an open mind. So when I took those photos, I thought, well, that's pretty amazing. And then people started saying, oh, what is that? And I said, I don't know, right? But of course, we're not the only individuals alive in the universe. Like that to me seems redundant, and insanely grandiose, not narcissistic, grandiose, right? Like narcissistic means you need all the light on you, right? Grandiose means you think you are the light, right? And humans keep making this mistake, right? I mean, we do so many amazing things that, of course, right, we're grandiose. Of course, we thought the sun revolved around the earth, and then Copernicus is like, dude, he's like the enemy now. He's saying, no, 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 the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. We revolve around the sun. And everyone's like, no, burn him, burn him on the stake, put him in the tower. And now, it's not that long ago, 500 years, right? My grandmother lived to 100 years old. It's 500 years. It's the same age as that chair over there. So then you start to think like, okay, obviously, what is it that we know that we don't know? Because that's the freedom to allow new information in. That's the freedom to then procure, right? New pathways, if you will. And for sure, there is other life. For sure, it's already touched Earth, it's touching Earth. And of course, there's, not a threat, because if there was a threat, it would already have happened. In other words, if something is so much more advanced and intelligent, then we wouldn't be here, But you want to keep an eye on it, right? Like, it's like, that movie, Age of Disclosure just came out, and it's quite good, particularly the last hour. And, one of the officials who was at the White House and high up in government for many years, he made a great analogy. He was saying, like, if you have ants, at the edge of your property, they're beautiful. It's no big deal. But as soon as they're like invading the home, then you need to say, okay, look, we need to really take a look at this situation here. What's going on? So you keep an eye on it, and so perhaps there are some forms of intelligence that are keeping an eye on us. Now, that being said, if you want to get creative, like even in another way, like you think about the Earth, right? And it's like this, and it's what, at 20,000 miles, around, right? Give or take, depending on how you're measuring the atmosphere. And you look at, like, we've only gone this deep around the perimeter, like very, very little down. So we don't know really what's at the center. Like, we don't even know what's halfway down to the center. We don't even know what's a third of the way down. We're like dealing with just like a little bit of the ocean, a little bit of the land. So what's going on down there? We have this idea that it's solid, but is it oceans? Are there oceans down there? Is it iron and ore and profound oceans down there, right? Like there could be on Mars and on, the moon, etc. I mean, obviously, these gravitational, trajectories indicate certain things about mass and density, but not necessarily about different types of minerals and substances that we don't know how they move and how they work and how they show up. So, what are the odds, in other words, that there are other forces down there? Like, you think about our paradigm of existence is that the universe is like 13.8 billion years ago and the Earth is like 4 something billion. And then, like, here we are, like, whatever, a million years old humans, it's like we were like, the last, as Carl Sagan would say, if the whole universe was a 24-hour clock, we're just like the last second, that's it. So that's a great paradigm to say, well, what is it that we don't know? Well, if we've only been around for the last second, and we certainly don't know what's underneath us, and we definitely don't know what's all above us and around us, right? So the question is there, and I don't think alien is necessarily the right word, is there transhuman intelligence? Yeah, I mean, look around, right? Like you look, at the moon, and it doesn't even, it looks always looking at us. Like that's pretty insane. And then you look out there at the galaxies and and then it's like this obsession with physics and the black holes. And it's like even Stephen Hawking at the end of his life, of course, there's other physics. Our physics is amazing. It's profound. But it's out the window in a black hole. Are we in a black hole right now? Probably. I mean, of course, like on some level, even if it's not just like if the Earth's this big and the black hole's this big, maybe we're not in one of these, but maybe we're on one that's as big as, LA compared to the pinpoint of my thumb. So I just think that the apprehension of intelligence and creativity and life and love, there is a cross section that when we say I'm available and I'm available to this, the term mind blown is very interesting because, you blow people's mind, when you present something that's foreign, that's a bust of a paradigm. And I think we're right at the precipice of experiencing that collectively on a broader level. And I think that's being indicated with a lot of the increasing instability, right, in the world in terms of the instability has always been there as far as we know it, but the world is more crowded. And so that instability, the information and indicators of that instability travels faster because we're more closely connected. And it's exciting. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. And then last thing I'll say on that, right, with UAPs and UFOs and transhuman intelligence, your own self, right? And this, is like a philosophical or spiritual text even. But if you think about how did you feel yesterday, you felt like yourself. How did you feel 10 years ago? You felt like yourself, like you felt like I. And then how did you feel when you were in third grade? Like you look different, you like different things, you're interested in different things, but you felt still I. What's your very first memory? How'd you feel? The exact same. So that's the same experience you had in the womb. That's the same experience you had early in the womb, right at conception. That's the same experience that you had in a in a place between the sperm, right, and the ovary before it becomes an embryo. That's the same experience you had without a locality. That's the same experience you had as the spark of light in your father's eye and your mother's eye. And so you can take that back as long as you want to go. That's the same experience, this I amness that every sentient being has, in fact, that God has, in fact, that the moon and the earth and all the stars has, that they all have. And so then when you think about transhuman intelligence, that's transhuman. In other words, we are derivative of transhuman intelligence. We are, on one level, the aliens. It's just that we're stuck in this paradigm of believing that this is all there is, this linear life in the human form. That to me is profoundly grandiose and ridiculous. Like, this is so amazing. And it's so complex and brilliant and mystical.
On this topic of transhumans, Sebastian, let's talk about Egypt and the pyramids. You know, who built them? Because the stones were sourced from like hundreds of miles away, and I think they did the math, like it would need an ungodly amount of slaves and like thousands of, it just doesn't add up. Like, what is their purpose? I've seen YouTubers talk about how it's a power generator. Tell me about your thoughts on the pyramids, Sebastian.
It's so fascinating. And I had this debate with my father, who's a brilliant scholar. And there's 3 million blocks, right? And they're between, 5,000 and 80,000 pounds. And like, you can't put a credit card between two of them. Like, they're that precisely constructed. So it's not just cutting it out of the mountain, and quarrying and then bringing them over on by a water or land or whatever the thing is. And then it's like laying them and then precisely carving them, right, in a way that we can't even do now. And then structuring them up, right? And then you look at the elaborate hallways and things, right, within. And then the idea is, right, was that these are tombs, and yet how many bodies have been discovered there, right? None. And then how many bodies around Egypt? Like, I don't know what the number is, but it's like over 1 million cats or something at other places, that are like buried with such care, and yet none in these grand pyramids, and bodies, in other places. And so it begs the question, right? Like, in, the idea of the Younger Dryas, which is like 12,000 years ago or something like that, when the world, went through after towards the end of the Ice Age, and then it heated up and then cooled and changed the water levels, right, really fast. And so you have this sense that, okay, those giant statues like on Easter Island, right? They weren't brought there by water. Back then, the land was so, the water was so low that they're brought there partially by water, but you can get there, from another continent because it's easy. You just hop, from island to island to island, land section to land section to land section. And so I think with Egypt, I think these pyramids are built perhaps 12,000 years ago, or let's say 1 million years ago. In other words, is it not obvious that there have been other forms of human intelligence that have existed before us and died out in the same way that we have run a high probability of dying out? And if there's unlimited time, like the clock doesn't end ever, it'll eventually show up again. Not like us, but different, but amazing too. And has that not already happened as well? Right. And so were the pyramids built with a different technology, with a different form, extrapolation of intelligence, a different form of human life, in other words, right? 12,000 years ago, probably, but maybe it's 1 million years ago. In other words, who inhabited the pyramids? For sure, Egyptians. Like, you're traveling and then you show up, and I'm really going to put the point on it here. And you're like, this is amazing. We got to live here. This boy, he's 12 or 14. Let's put him in charge. You know what I mean? Like, this is insane, and then look at all these carvings of what these individuals look like. We're going to start dressing like that and making masks like that and learning from these incredible carvings, right? But there's nothing to show. No bodies in the pyramids. So then what? They just were like, and then what? They built 3 in Giza, and then they were just like, oh, lovely. That was nice. We're done building. And then if you read it, online, it's like, oh, they ran out of resources. It's like, no, there's no buildings like that within insane amount of distances. Just these 3. And then it's like, okay, that was good. We worked on that 3 million blocks for like, 1,000 years or a few hundred years or whatever the thing is. And nobody buried in there, and we're not building any others. That's ridiculous. I mean, on every practical level, that's ridiculous, right? And so another intelligence built that. And then you start to take into consideration how they line up incredibly, pointing at, zodiac signs and systems, and the complexity, of that just indicates, right, an obvious mistake, what Alfred Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that it's our knowing that's amazing, but that is in danger of fooling us. That we know so much with physics and with archaeology, that misguides us. And that's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that we believe the world is concrete, that it is the way we see it, but it never is, right? The map is never the territory, so to speak. And then, you look at that and you think, well, okay, even though when we carbon date things, right, we don't carbon date stone. We carbon date like, things that like grass and, pieces of wood and stuff like that. So we don't know when these things were made. And, what is this obsession? What is this fetish with saying, oh no, this was built, 4,000 years ago, or around this time? It's ridiculous, right? It's insane, and I think it's also it's lacking of wonder. Like it doesn't like it's amazing what's occurring there 4,000 years ago already. Like that's enough. We don't have to know, but humans, yeah, collectively feel like we have to know, and then I think the moment we have to know, we destroy the kiss, so to speak. We destroy the day, we destroy life, we destroy love, we destroy the potential of the future, we destroy the potential of the moment. Yeah.
Interesting. On the topic of defunking, Sebastian, the way influencers and social media consume people's lives, like we're talking about information right now, and I saw this clip that talked about how time is actually not the most valuable asset, but it's your attention. Two people can have the same 24 hours, but one person is just getting their attention sucked in by social media. Like, are we spending too much time watching what other people are doing versus actually doing it ourselves? Like, does this phenomenon ever end?
God, you nailed it. It really is the number of people who are, and you take let's say two categories. Let's say health, because that's a huge one on social media, fitness, eating, etc. And psychology, right, is another one, right? And the number of people, who are regurgitating things, and people get sucked into it saying, oh, okay, like I should eat this and I should, exercise more. And then I see it, right, at the gym, obviously, and you see it, outside. For every 30 minutes watching that, it's 30 minutes not doing it, And if you think about the fundamentals of it, none of it changes. Like eat food that grows from the earth, move your body. That's it in terms of physicality. And if people aren't doing that, then they're seeking something that feels better and is easier. Well, can I eat something that's really sweet and indulgent and it'll do something amazing for me and I won't have to go do the hard work or the physicality or go for the run or whatever? And that's really missing the mark. In other words, it's all prescriptive, right, is the operative word. The idea is eat this, do this to get this. Whereas, you know, if you just fall in love with it, like children love to play, right? As children, we love to play and sweat and laugh. And if we just keep playing and moving and sweating and laughing, we're all going to be healthy and just eat stuff that grows from the earth. Like you look at a blueberry or broccoli or lettuce and you taste it like right from the earth. It's amazing. Like it's amazing. Put some lemon on there and you make some different salts and simple sauces and things like this. Is incredible. Like we don't need them much more than that, and we've been operating like that for at least thousands of years, at least a million years, and other animals seem to be doing fine. So why is it that humans are the only ones who have this health fitness problem? Because we're the only ones thinking about it too much. And how's the way we think about it? Well, this is a lot of thinking about the health and fitness, right? Move the body, eat foods from the earth. That's it. That's it, And it's so fundamental and so simple. And so yes, I think that most of the people who are on social media are really trying to sell something, I've been very fortunate. I bought my first home as a byproduct of the relationship between being on and producing those magazine covers for Men's Fitness and Iron Man and Muscle Media and Fitness RX and all those things. And I was just like, look, I love to do this. I love to exercise. And I'm not here to sell anything. And people would do interviews and ask me about my workout, and I don't keep track. I'm pushing my whole body to the limit. I like to push myself. It's really about the emotional, intellectual thing, and then the physicality is a byproduct, yeah, of that. And then I think with psychology, same thing, right? Like Sam Altman, said on when he was did his interview with Tucker. Altman said, yeah, look, more people are committing suicide, getting advice from ChatGPT around psychology. And that indicates a lot of the need to be positively reinforced for things that we are complacent about, right? If you don't like the way your husband or wife is talking to you, ask ChatGPT or Grok, they'll tell you you're right. 100%. On some level, they'll influence you. You're right. If you think that taking this drug or copping out on some level, you ask and it'll tell you ultimately on a subtle level to do that. So those systems are very powerful for researching a car, perhaps, or a religion, or something that's, clear, like, how to build a foundation of a house, let's say, but not good for abstract thinking, like for, relational things on a deep level, because that requires both rational thinking and pragmatic thinking and trans-rational thinking, meaning intuitive, right? And those things don't have, that AI doesn't have the capacity for that. And so I think that on social media, online, it's very important to go in with an intent. Say, look, I'm going to give myself 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and I'm only going to consume bang, 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 these three things, and they're going to be different. And I'm going to try, one, I'm going to put 10 minutes on each, and I'm going to try one that's totally new and see if I like it. But then afterwards, I'm going to keep a pad, right? And I'm going to write down what I like and don't like and who I'm going to pay attention to again. Because then all of a sudden, you're forging your own intelligence, right? You're constructing your own consciousness versus your consciousness is being constructed and influenced by randomness and what the algorithm indicates you're already susceptible to liking. And my TEDx talk is about that on some level, right?
On that same topic of AI, and with how fast it's accelerating, Sebastian, like, do you think AI will eventually take over human creativity and intellectual labor? For example, I don't know if it could, but is there a future where this conversation, this podcast is completely AI generated with the simple prompt of, I want a podcast conversation between Sebastian Siegel, Andy Mai, where they talk about aliens. And it has all our data, it has all our content online, and it just recreates this.
That's a brilliant question. No. And the reason why is because of yeah, you can get something that's a simulation for sure. That probably comes close on a lot of levels. But I'm always going to be saying something new because I'm growing. And what I have to offer, the TEDx talk that I gave, the next one I do will be very different. Meaning that the fundamentals will be there, but we're taking text from life and applying it to life. And those are the exteriors being filtered on some way and then extrapolated outwards again. But I'm also growing on the inside radically, right? And so that changes, So what the question really offers and why it's so important, your question, is that it really indicates what is the skill set in the age of AGI. The skill set becomes presence. And that means letting go of the past, not having concern for the future, meaning 10 minutes ago and 1 second from now. Just presence. That presence becomes the greatest love we can give to our friends, to each other, just to ourselves. And the individuals who have the capacity to be present are going to really, really find the deepest levels of fulfillment and joy. Because if we're present, we're choosing things, individuals, circumstances, experiences that really we are aware, this lights up my cells on a certain level. I'm going to do this. We become in touch with our intuition, and it's a practice. And I think that, when we're present, right, we feel so good. And when we're not, we can't give anything to anybody else, because if we're not here ourselves, how can we show up for anyone else? And AI, because it's not sentient, because it doesn't have a birth or a death, there's no consequence. And so presence is not a factor. It can only simulate. So no, will it upset a lot of people? The more impulsive people are, the more they're going to be rocked by it and influenced by it, for sure. That being said, also on a financial level, to kind of tangentially, right, to shift the gear a little bit, is like, the railroads, when they came around, it was like, man, this is the jam. Everybody's in. And financially, America went all in, to the railroads. And it was amazing, right? But then it was like the car came around and it was like, all right, well, like all these railroad employees, builders were put out of work. In other words, like this is going to move fast. And then there's this huge bubble that's happening now where it just doesn't, the financials don't work out. The amount of, sort of hundreds of billions of dollars, that are going into this, more than $1 trillion, several $1 trillion going into this, that it just, there's not enough stuff. Like, what do you use right now? Like, I use a little grok, it's not bad, but what do you use? Like, I mean, I don't know. I researched some stuff. GPS is cool, right? Like, I don't know. I use, if you use a speaker system in your house, like how many times does it go off and doesn't work? How's your spell check on your iPhone? Like, I don't know, it's not very good, you know? So like, is this going to offer that? Do I really want a robot in my house doing all these things for me? I don't know. I like brushing my teeth. I like washing my dishes, I don't know. Like, if somebody like wants to just have life be done for them, then like, what comes next? Oh, will you kiss my wife for me to make sure she's happy? You know? Like, how much do we need to outsource? Like, there's a pleasure in cutting a log and building a cabin and lighting a fire. And the danger becomes missing out on that. So it'll upset a lot of lives. And the more independent and autonomous, the term temperantia, fiducia, constantia, right? Directness of life, self-reliance, simplicity of purpose. The idea that we just, this is okay. Like I'm human, and there's a mandate for that. In other words, to be human, I need to stand up. I need to wake up. I need to put myself together. I need to breathe deeply. I need to care. I need to collaborate. I need to see. And I look at my hands. I say, wow, everybody has this. These were meant for building and caring and caressing and working. And I don't want to outsource all that because that seems fundamental, innate to what existence and life really is.
Earlier, you just mentioned sort of how, we're all consuming content and it's simple. We should just eat fruits that are grown from the ground, have an active lifestyle, and that's all it takes. You've been on over 100 magazine covers without taking any drugs, and you're still in incredible shape 20 years later, Sebastian. Like, how did you maintain this? What's your secret?
Hmm. Hmm. Thanks. It's interesting the concern, right, with drugs, and it's not a moral issue, right? Obviously, I work at a Gold's Gym in Venice, and I know many of the greatest bodybuilders in history, and for them, taking certain anabolics is requisite to them being able to succeed. And I understand it, and for me, I've never taken anything, and it was just that it wasn't worth the risk, and also I wasn't playing any professional sport, like I wasn't interested in going to the NFL or something like this. I just loved training really hard. And so the physicality was a byproduct of it, right? And then I look at, friends, who've climbed Everest, multiple times or, done insane treks, who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and what are they doing, right? And it's just this rigorousness of saying, wake up and deal with the pain of life, deal with the hot and the cold and the physicality of it. Don't be so ginger with yourself, right? Like as Ram Dass would say. And I think there is a dangerous thing, right? Obviously with the TRT situation, because so many men are taking that. And again, it's not a moral issue or a judgment. I mean, so many guys come up to me and ask me about it, and I don't, I've never taken any. And sounds tempting. I'm just concerned that if I was to take it, boy, and I've consulted people and asked because I'm curious, like, somebody takes it and they seem to be kicking ass, but it scares me because like then what, like that's it, like you got to take that now for life. It scares me a little bit, right? Like I know if I eat a little bit of sugar, like that's a pretty powerful drug. All of a sudden I need more of that. I don't want to take something that's really that profound, and so I think that's a dangerous one. I think we're going to start to see a lot of challenges around that because it's becoming so commonplace because it seems like that's got to feel so good so fast, right? And there are other things that are precursors, to our, hormonal and physical response, by which we can affect the scale quite a bit, And again, I don't have anything to sell. So people who really swear by these things really go against me on that. And I'm not going against them. I think that's fine. I think if you want to take a lot of cocaine, that's fine. It sounds fun, but it seems like there's a lot of consequence. To me, the testosterone thing seems like there's just a lot of consequence and it seems scary to me. And there are, the long-term studies. I don't know, it doesn't look that good, that promising. I think stem cells is a interesting one. I think there are two types of, there are a few types of stem cells, but some are coming from an umbilical cord, which to me draws a real serious moral question, just from like trafficking kids and women and I don't know. I would avoid that at all costs. Like, there are companies who've said, hey, try our stem cells for free, give us an endorsement. And no, no, no. And then there's like one that comes from it gets stuck in the, fallopian tube and has to be aborted and never becomes an embryo. And okay, so like that's kind of pre-human and there's no consequence there. And then also this cell can be split like millions of times. So from one person, right, the artifact from one individual, and that then it's super healthy, it's off put, and then all right, now you're taking something that isn't derivative of pregnancy. I think that's a real concern for illness, for consequence, for enslavement, of humanities, like in the Matrix, kind of that really draws a lot of concerns on the stem cell level. I also think that it's a question about efficacy, like how much do these things really matter? Being around some of the greatest athletes in the world, right? In boxing, in football, and fighting. I've seen people take these certain stem cells in their knee or something, have a great experience, and then like a year or 2 years later, been like, I don't know, seemed good for the first few months. And, I don't know. Now it comes down to just you got to do the rehab and you got to massage it and you got to ice it and you got to do exercises and those things. So I think that there are potentials, yeah, moreover with that. But I think that the question about where it comes from becomes really important. And I think that the willingness of people to kind of try anything and also to look at the people who are selling it, like, are these people business people or are they health people and what are they first? Because success leaves clues and so does failure. And so I don't want to take anything, unless I really know what it is, yeah, that I'm taking, yeah, unless I really, really know. And I think people should do that research before getting into anything. And I know a company that is doing a stem cell that is like that comes just from the fallopian tube. And is aborted. And so then, there's not a human component there of it coming from an embryo early in pregnancy, right? Or from an umbilical cord, certainly. That seems to be really popular, which is mind-blowing to me because that seems to offer up obvious, scary consequences potentially. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks so much for touching on the TRT and stem cell topic. Another thing that shocked me, Sebastian, is you used to eat meat and you don't anymore and you're still in amazing shape. Why did you stop and what changed for you?
Thanks. When I was a boy, my father lived in Hawaii and my mother moved to South Texas, San Antonio, and I lived with my mother and my stepfather. And he was a real disciplinarian and he had a ranch in South Texas, Pearsall, and then another ranch called Encinal. And it was a big game ranch, and we hunted and deep sea fished in Port O'Connor in South Texas in the Gulf, and we went way out, 4 in the morning, and come back late at night and fish deep in the Gulf. And we would hunt deer and white-tailed deer. And the first deer that I shot was with my stepfather, and he taught me how to gut it and clean it, and really take care of the amazing offering that the world was giving to us and his integrity and care for the land. We used every part of the animal. Yeah, every part. He would make like bookmarks and things from the fur, the hide, and then we would have chili and we would use the organ meat for other things and all these kinds of things. So that to me, struck me really early on as something that's beautiful. Like in other words, it shaped me later that I became dissociated with how the animal comes to the plate, as most of us are. Like most people will say, I love my dog, right? I love dogs so much, and yet they go to eat a hamburger, right? But like most of those burgers are, first of all, coming from like thousands of animals that are like insanely, relentlessly tortured their entire life. Like, how can you love your dog and like hate all other animals by supporting their torture with your dollar? So I'm okay with the death, but I'm not okay with the torture. For me, that was where it landed for me. And I'm not here to judge or change anyone else, but I just couldn't support it anymore. Once you see a steer or a cow cry, and you hold it, it's like, man, this animal is the most gentle animal on the planet. Like you can stab a cow and it won't attack you, and this animal only eats grass, and like some worms that go into that. And so it's like, how can we do that? And even our testing for chemicals and things like this, the dogs that we use are the beagle. And the reason we use beagles in testing is because they're the most docile dog that will not fight back. So we take the most gentle dog of all the dogs, right? More gentle than the pug, the cocker spaniel, like the beagle, that you can like pick this dog and it just won't bite you. It just won't fight back. And that's so brutal to think that we do that. And we do the same thing with cattle and cow. And I just, I hit a point in my life where it was like, I can't do it anymore. And I quit dairy like 20 something years ago. And then, because I was just like, this is brutal. I also was starting to feel like it made my skin look bad and I was having, just not good for digestion. That being said, I had a friend who would go find a wild cow at this thing he would do with his daughter called camping with the cows. And he would milk the cow in a jar and he'd bring it to me and I would drink that, right? And if I went hunting, I would be okay shooting an animal, wild animal, and eating it. Okay. But I'm not okay with outsourcing the torture of those animals and then commoditizing that sentience and calling it steak. That's really, I think, a scary, scary, scary thing. In other words, it comes down to like, that's a sort of spiritual practice thing. Like, I'm okay with my own death. I forgive my taker, but I'm not okay if somebody wants to torture me. Right. And so I'm okay with the killing. I keep it sacred, but I'm not okay torturing. That's unacceptable to me. So it comes down to a question of integrity, not even spirituality. Like, do you have integrity? Do I have integrity? And once I turned the corner on that, it was just like, okay, now I'm eating 90% plant-based. I eat some seafood. And it's just like, wow, not only am I performing the same, and I'm the same now, I'm 6'1", 200 pounds, 195 pounds, 4 or 5% body fat, no difference and more energy. And I'll say with the energy thing, when it comes to food, you think about, men and women who are climbing like Everest and, climbing all the peaks in the Himalayas. Like, what are they eating? They're eating like beans and garbanzos. Why? Because it digests so fast. They just digest, boom, ready to go. Like you have a salad, right? And somebody calls you and you go, you're like, boom, you're ready to go. Where do you eat? Chicken or steak and like, whoa, you need a nap. Like, there's forget about it, So, that's a factor on a personal kind of selfish level. But, that was derivative of me making a change in my life that I thought, I can't live with myself if I'm supporting this brutality in the world. Like I'm not an asset in the world. I'm now taking from the world. And then you look at so many brilliant people, right? Whether it's, Jobs or, Einstein or Nikola Tesla, or, I mean, you just look up like, brilliant vegan people and it's just like the list is insane, and it's like, wow, well, all right. I don't need anything that, like Einstein, pretty smart guy, I don't think I need to think more than him, right? And then you look at like all these incredible athletes, right? Who are just, doing insanely incredible things, like some of the greatest fighters in the world now in MMA, like the Diaz, Nate Diaz. He's vegan, and he's just beating the hell out of guys, knocking their, just bloodying their whole bodies. And he's 100% vegan, this guy. And the sweetheart, by the way, as well. And a lot of the Gracies in jiu-jitsu are as well. So then it just comes down to our, like, what's the story? Like, who are we lying to? And so for me, I couldn't follow that lie or that paradigm anymore. And I was like, I love animals too much. I really love animals. And I'm so grateful to be one here and to experience them. And it feels to me to not have integrity, to be able to want to not kill, but to torture that. That seems repugnant to me.
Talk about sort of the world, you talk about death, you talk about experiencing life, Sebastian. And this makes me think of God. Do you have a proof for God, Sebastian? In your TED talk, you mentioned an exercise that demonstrates this. Can you sort of walk us through it?
Thank you for that. Yes. And we touched on it a few minutes ago, a little bit, right? But the proof of God, is, I think, experientially is pretty simple, which is just if you take a breath, right, and you close your eyes and you just think, who am I? Well, okay, I have the sense of me here now, and I'm experiencing listening to this, but I have this I am. In other words, who's the entity, the intelligence, the perspective that's experiencing this voice, sound? It's a sense of I that's invisible that maybe exists somewhere in some sort of darkness and light when we close our eyes. So then now, like, you open your eyes again, right? And then you think, okay, I've always had that. Like I had that yesterday, right? Whoever's listening to this, I had that. Did you have that 10 years ago? Like whatever you were doing, whoever you were involved with, did you have that 20 years ago, Did you have that in first grade when you were holding a cup of water or juice and doing something when you were running on the playground, like you were a little kid and you were running and laughing and crying and upset and happy? But you still had the sense, the same exact sense that you have right now of I am. You look different, you sound different, you like different things, but the exact same thing. And so then therefore your very first memory, it's still the same I am. And so you draw that back to really the sensibility precognitive, meaning pre-rational, inside the womb, it's still this sense of I am. And you take that back to the fertilization, and the marriage of the sperm and the egg, and then you say, okay, that's still the sense of I am. And then even something that doesn't have a locality, take that back to the first time your mother ever sees your father and the spark in his eyes and her eyes. You're not in either, but you're in both and you're beyond, right? And that's this I am. And so then how far back does that go? Your grandparents, their grandparents, right? Splitting off and go back a million years to the primates before us. The same exact I am that those primates have. Different, but same I am. You watch a gorilla, you watch a cat, your dog. It's the same I am, exact, that every sentient being has. And if you take it back far enough, same I am really that every ant, right? Not the same in the way that we experience, but the same sense of, okay, I'm an entity. I've got to go do this egoic sense of I am, right? But really that goes beyond entity, right? That's the originator 4 billion years ago, the Earth, back 13.8 billion years ago to the cosmos, the beginning of this universe as we perceive it, or as the story that we tell ourselves now. But the point is, it doesn't have a locality, it doesn't have a space-time location. That this I amness is the origin of consciousness. That is, the essential Godhead, shunyata, ta ta ta, neither this nor that. That William James would talk about, you take any sense of non-duality and give it a name, X, right? Shunyata, Godhead, non-duality. It's neither this nor that, nor both, nor neither, right? It's indescribable. We can't use this language to describe it. That is just this I amness, just this presence. And so that's proof of God. And that's not intellectual, right? That's experiential. That if someone sits with us here and now and reverses that and tries to just talk through that, you can't talk yourself out of that. You just feel it back to yesterday, to fifth grade, to first grade, to first grade. Wow. And then you look around, everyone else is feeling that same I amness, and that's proof of God. Like, it's pretty mystical and spectacular. And I think that there's a value to touching that, because it has us feeling in the human way more indelible. And so then therefore fearless or courageous, meaning that part of me is here now and wants to live and hold on to this life and do well and procure joy and love and connection. But the other part of me is okay dying. The part of me that doesn't associate with this in me, that's this I amness. And the combination of just enough courage and knowing that we go on forever, this I amness goes on forever, outside of space-time, no future, no past, and this enough one foot in this world, egoic, self, sense, procure, create the dance, duality. And it's important to have both. And we're in this world, so much of this, and the people who seem to be graceful and at ease, we become more like that when we jump into this a little bit as well, as much as we can, because then it tempers this. It says, hey, man, it's all like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like for God, it's just, and God is not an external other, right? It's an extrapolation of all, invisible and physical, right? And it doesn't care about pain and joy. It's just stimulus, it's just stimulus. And so we touch that a little bit, and it allows us to not get so attached to the highs and not be so daunted to the lows.
I love the simplicity of I am. I guess it then leads me to question, why is there all this pain in the world? What's happening in Palestine, or the wars that's been happening around the world. Like, why did this universe, this sort of I amness begin in the first place? What is its purpose?
Yeah, it's a great, really beautiful question. Like, there's just non-duality, just Godhead, and the question, right? Why come into being? What does it take to get a universe going. And it's really a perspective, which means a self and another, right? So God has to split off into two, into duality, a self and another. And if you just try to perceive that in some sort of visual sense, which is beyond our capacity to imagine, but we can use a placeholder for it. And let's just say it's like electrical lightning, and it just splits off, right? And a self and another, and there's a dance. And then there's an interior and an exterior, right? And Ken Wilber draws that in the quadrants, you know? And for Godhead, for non-duality, right? For just pure I am, just nothingness, right? It's nice to have intimacy because then all of a sudden there's a game, there's a play that the two hands get to touch. There's the Zen koan, right? What's the sound of one hand clapping, right? Like there's no answer, right, to that. It's kind of funny because it's like, okay, with the origin of duality means oh, this is nice. Oh, that hurts. I miss you. And so it introduces both that, oh, that's sweet. And we become consumed, particularly in the West, with no more of this, more of this, none of this, none of this. And the idea right behind that spiritual practice is to say, ah, so sweet. And then when we split, to say, ah, the tears are indicative. And I mean that etymologically, indicative. Indicative. They demonstrate how wonderful the joy was. And so the tears are another celebration of that in the parting. And so Godhead wants that intimacy, wants to experience that, wants to be able to look at the rainbow and say, isn't that beautiful? To share it with someone, to allow two beings to come together, two somethings to come together and create another something, and not with an end. There's no objective, but just the process of the doing of that, and there's so much pain. But there's a little bit more joy than pain, just a little bit, enough to keep the whole thing going, which is why we're here. If it was all brutality, it wouldn't be here anymore because it already would have said, nah, enough, and the Hindu idea is that it does that every once in a while, just enough and start over, you know, and that's written into all religions as well, I mean, that's the idea, with all religions, like end it and then begin again. Okay. Clean the slate, right? Like even a human, right? Like you eat and then you digest and same thing with a person, like you come out of the womb and then into the grave, and it's like, okay, like the same thing with all the entire cosmos, and I'm hugely influenced. Obviously, my father's a professor of Indian religions, and so the Hindu iconography has a huge impact on me, as indicated in Grace and Grit. My, first movie is indicated in my next movie, which is about this young chess grandmaster, as indicated in my TED Talk, as indicated in the questions in my YouTube series, this idea that there are things to do to make it better, to feel amazing and to be deeply fulfilled and connective. But it's all pretty funny and ridiculous, and mystical, and we've got to be able to let go, and so I'm here to help and support people in the letting go part in order to make it more fulfilling. But you can't just go after the fulfilling. You have to be willing to let go. It's a paradox, like the breath in and breath out. Right? The deeper the release, the better the next in-breath. The better the next in-breath, the better the release.
I love that, Sebastian. On that topic of experience, in your writing, you explore physics, manifestation, particle, and waves. How does modern physics help us understand consciousness?
There's so many interesting people who are describing things about physics and consciousness, and there are a lot of really wonderful, wonderful people. And I gave this keynote not too long ago, a few months ago, at the INI, the Institute for Neuroscience Innovation. My keynote was on about the universe being conscious, which 5 years ago would have been totally like faux pas, right? But now people are starting to think, okay, well, all right, that makes sense. And I think people in physics, obviously they're studying physicality, the movement, right, of particles, atoms, quarks, protons, neutrons, electrons, etc. And so, how do they interact, and how do waves and particles, when observed, show up differently, right? Just by being measured. And they do. There's a lot to consider there, though, because one of those things is the way they perform, but others is also they have an intelligence of their own. And our perception of that is also derivative of their intelligence because we are made up of that, and so that's something to consider. It's not just us looking at them. It's like they are us also. And I think that part is not being bridged well. And I've written a paper recently in a competition, which I don't know, we'll see how it goes. But my next TED Talk will also entertain that more. The consciousness, the sense of it is that it's like, okay, this tying it to physicality, right? And I think Ken Wilber's been writing about this, extensively and quite comprehensively since the 90s, initially with his book Sex Ecology and Spirituality, which is hands down one of the most brilliant books ever written. And then he did an abridged version of that called A Brief History of Everything, which is like 400 pages. And it's like just the most brilliant, like magnum opus. It's like, it's just mind blowing. That book changed my life. And, he's saying that, like, in other words, the physical and the unmanifest show up in tandem, right? They show up in tandem. So I think that the physics part of it is really cool to see it because people need reassurance. People like looking at things and understanding, jumping into the concept of string theory and possibility, or looking at, the way particles change and mirror neurons, show up and engage and interact and react. And I think the part, though, that's missing in that is the notion, right, that we're also derivative of that. So there's a complex intelligence that we presume about ourselves that we're also, like Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced continuous, that we're presuming that proton, neutron, electron, subatomic particle doesn't have, when in fact it's the collection of those things that we are. So how can it not, right? Like, it's been operating a lot longer, and we are just some sort of brief pattern that's demonstrating some sort of capacity, for description and iteration of this story, right? And even, like, everybody understands, like, subatomic particles can go through us, right? They boom, right through us, without even, and this is what these movies like The Matrix are predicated on, the bend, whether it's of the spoon or the person, right? Yeah, like anything is possible. But it begins initially with the surrender of the idea of the world as being, as Alan Watts would call it, ceramic, that it's structured and that intelligence grows out of that structure. Yes, intelligence does grow out of that structure, but that's not the only thing that's happening. That structure is also a derivative of intelligence. And so the two things show up in tandem. And I, I mean, I lean towards, my specialty being in, storytelling and psychology and philosophy. Like, that part has to be married to the physics because I have, a sense of the physicality, a very strong sense. Yeah. But my background is in, like, the sort of integral and Jungian sense. And so, like, my TEDx talk is about the invisible forces. And I talk about the physical forces. I lay out in like 2 minutes, the first minute of that talk. The talk's only 8 minutes long, my TEDx talk. The first, I don't know, 70 seconds, I lay out sort of a brief history of the universe from, the Big Bang to today. And then I jump into the invisible forces for like 4 minutes or something like that. And it's fast, a lot to take in, and leaning into those invisible forces becomes important because that's something that Chat GPT or Grok can't do. And that's something that when couples, come into my office, that's the part that's really valuable, right? In terms of finding fulfillment in our life and deeper love with another individual. It requires really feeling our intuition and having the courage to say, what is it that really I can feel in my cells? What am I triggered by with the other person? What am I triggered by in me because of the other person? It's not about the other person, but it's just about the way I'm perceiving the other person. Then all of a sudden there's big, big, big breakthroughs, right?
That's beautiful. Last thing I wanted to touch on, and you brought it up earlier, you talked about storytelling. You're working on a new chess movie, Sebastian. What inspired this story?
It's called Labyrinth, The Youngest Grandmaster, and it's a story about the youngest grandmaster, chess grandmaster in history. His name's Abhimanyu Mishra, and he's about 16 now. And he was 12 and a half when he became youngest grandmaster. So by context, in 1958, Bobby Fischer became youngest grandmaster when he was 15. And then someone broke it, 14, and then 13, and then Karakin, the Russian, he became youngest grandmaster like just before 13. And he held that record for 19 years, right? 19 years, so he's like, you know, in his 30s now. He's a brilliant chess player, right? And so Abhimanyu Mishra broke it just a few years ago at 12 and a half during the shutdown when there were no games happening. So it's very hard, him and his father, Hemant, and his whole family, his wife and his sister, to do that was like an impossible feat. And he just did it, right? Just he had to beat a lot of his mentors and, adults, legendary chess players who are Indian and Chinese and Russian and American. And so one of the stories is a father-son story, this Indian family in America. And it's a story like Queen's Gambit about chess. But another story is about the Mahabharata, and I tie it to his namesake, Abhimanyu in the Mahabharata, who's Arjuna's son, the hero of the Mahabharata. And it's an epic tale, a mythic tale that takes place in an unknown time, 5,000 years ago or millions of years ago in a mythic time, and a story of today. So on some level, it's like Star Wars. It's a story of this hero, right? It's a story of a hero, and it's an amazing story, true story about the American dream, and a story about chess, absolutely, and how life is also this labyrinth.
That's beautiful, and I love how you always have this consistent theme of circling things back to God, transcendence, and invisible forces. And I guess you just shared then how you've done the same for this chess movie.
Very much so, yeah.
Sebastian.
Yeah. And but I do it softly, like Avatar. You go to see Avatar, the first one, with 10 friends, and everybody leaves and it's like, I loved it, I know what it's about, and everybody disagrees on what it was about, but everybody's right. So it's lightheaded. It's a true story, but it's going to be brilliant actors, a brilliant star from India, in China, in Russia, in America, and but it's ultimately, about transcendence. It's about the hero's journey for sure.
Sebastian, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people get more of you? The TED Talk, the 8 questions, your Instagram. Please share everything.
Thanks so much. Those links are all in my bio on Instagram. And I reply to all the messages eventually on there if someone's connected with me, if they follow me. And the TEDx talk is there. It's also on the TED website, just TEDx Sebastian Siegel. It's linked on my Instagram. The 8 questions, the EIGHT on YouTube. It's also, I think, linked. And there's a bunch of brilliant people there, Ken Wilber, and fighters and surfers and people burned alive and a billionaire and people in art and media, etc. And obviously Grace and Grit, the movie, it's on Amazon and Apple. That's also linked on my IG page and on my website, just myname.com. And the psychology stuff is all linked there as well, deeplyconscious.com, my psychology site. So thanks so much for having me. It's such an honor.
No, thank you, Sebastian. It was this cool journey, this conversation, and by the end of it, I just feel so much love and warmth, and you definitely sort of brokerage that experience through this conversation. Just hearing you've sort of motivated me even more to just follow my passion and pursue my dreams. Just seeing how beautifully you've been able to do so in your life, and how just by doing what you love, sort of this beautiful life has unfolded. And I think people are scared to follow their dreams because the initial objections are like, I can't make money traveling, I can't make money working out, I can't make money being a kind human being. But I think you mentioned on our last conversation, that's the fun part, figuring out how to financially make money being a kind person, for example. And I want to thank you again for brokeraging the opportunity for me to interview Ken Wilber and have him twice on my show. It was definitely thanks to you coming on initially to talk about the movie, and then you letting me know about his upcoming book, and just having you on, that sort of made it easy for me to reach out to Ken. So I appreciate that. And yeah, it's so cool how we started this conversation, the sun was still out and I could see the beautiful view from your clear windows, and we saw the transition as sun set and now it's dark out. So this was a very beautiful journey that we went on.
Very much so. For me too. Thanks so much for having me.
Guys, if you made it to the end, please let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you guys learned something new and sort of had as much fun as I did sort of doing this interview. And I'll see you guys next week on another episode of the podcast. Peace.